Okay, so we are back with another episode of I Don't Think You've Seen This Film. And this week's episode will focus on the movie Enter Nowhere. Now, before I get into the movie, let's go over the rules real quick. They're quick, simple. 1, I'm going to do absolutely no spoilers. 2, I'm not going to do any movie that's on my box office bomb series. And 3, I'm not doing any huge major release like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. I'm doing more obscure movies, maybe a couple of like Hollywood release films that underperformed at the box office or at one time may have been big but have long been forgotten. And so kind of that way. I will be doing mostly indies though. There will be some exceptions to that every now and then. And today, like I said before, we are focusing on Enter Nowhere. It's an independent movie focusing on 3 people in a cabin. Let's get into it.
Hello? Is anybody out there?
Yeah, I'm going crazy. I could have sworn I was headed in a straight line, and then I just ended up back here. This isn't my cabin.
Then what are you doing here?
Same as you. Car trouble. What's your story?
I need to get the hell out of here.
Give the lock. What?
Okay, so real quick, before I start talking about this movie, I want to give you a little warning. If you're watching this for the first time on a DVD, like you find this on DVD and you grab it and you pop it in, be warned. All the trailers, like before this movie, are like highly graphic, torture porn type slasher movies. Like, you're seeing stuff like Human Centipede, okay? And first time I saw this, we were renting it through rental, and we popped in the movie, and like, all of us watch it, it's just like, I don't want to see this. Because, like, judging from the commercials, the trailers that happened before the main menu kicked on, it's like, yeah, this seems like it's going to be a terrible movie. And we watched the movie, and like, there's barely any blood in this movie. Like, a person gets shot at one point, and like, they're holding their hand over the wound, and that's it. So like, just for some reason, the person who set up the DVD menu or the DVD for this movie, it's like, yeah, let's just throw in a bunch of movies like Saw 7 in here for the trailers. But no, basically what this story is about. It's about 3 strangers who wind up in a cabin out in the woods. They've all equally lost in their own way. And weird things start happening. I don't want to tell you any more than that. You should go in this movie as fresh as humanly possible. But one of the great things about this movie is the solid cast. Like, there's a couple of decent names. Like, one of the guys at the beginning of the movie is like, yeah, you've definitely seen him in a couple other things, but like Scott Eastwood, this is something that he was in long before he started becoming more of a known name. And then Elizabeth Watterson, I believe her name is, the woman who's in Alien Covenant. Okay, like she did this long before she did that. And so they're kind of unknown actors here when this movie was made, but it's kind of neat seeing them years later. Like, to try and do this movie now, today, in this time, it would be considerably more expensive getting these actors than it would have been back when they made this movie. And like, the setup is very simple, and like, the story is simple at first, but it's really solid. I like the story. It's a pretty interesting story, and one thing that helps make the story really interesting is the dialogue. There's some pretty good, solid dialogue in this movie. There's a couple of lines that don't quite land, but for an independent film, the acting's pretty decent in this film, and the dialogue's pretty decent, so props there. Another thing that I noticed about this movie is it seemed like a really affordable movie to make. Like, there's not a lot of locations. This did not seem like a very expensive movie to make, and I always am a little impressed by movies when you can give me a good story at a good time, and it looks like you barely spent anything at all. That's like indicative of a solid director and writer. And so I definitely want to look up what else this writer and director have done since Enter Nowhere. And then another thing I really liked about this movie is, for a movie that's not an action movie, the pacing is really good. Like, this is a very well-paced movie, and there's, like, barely any type of action in this film whatsoever. It's mostly dialogue, and it manages to keep the pacing pretty good with this film. And so I did really enjoy that. Now, in terms of any criticisms I have about this film, I would say probably my biggest criticism would be the editing. Like, the editing was rough in a couple of places, and then I feel the ending was just a bit abrupt. Like, I don't think it's a terrible ending, but just, I would have liked to have seen the ending a tiny bit longer. Like, maybe 2 or 3 minutes longer, just to kind of flesh a couple of things out. But despite those flaws, Enter Nowhere was a really fantastic time. I really enjoyed it. It's one of those great, like, suspense thrillers you can pop on at night before you go to bed. It's a pretty decent popcorn film. Leans a little bit more towards the horror aspect than action, but I wouldn't quite call this a horror film. I'd call it a thriller. I think that's a more accurate genre to label this under than horror. The trailers kind of depict it as being a horror, but I don't think it actually is a horror film. So, anyway, that's been my review of Enter Nowhere. I don't think you've seen this movie, and my name's Chris O'Connell with 11 Hour Reviews, and that will be all for today.